Welcome to this early February 2025 episode of Dialogues with Creators. Over the last 3 years of podcasting, I have talked with over 50 fascinating people from all walks of life. On this show, I'm going solo to talk about one of my favorite subjects, fiction and fiction writing. Please keep listening for So You Want to Write a Novel. The first thing I want to say is that I feel like I'm something of an expert on this subject for 3 reasons. And I guess I feel like I have to justify my existence here. I have, first of all, a master's degree in English, which a lot of folks who even know me don't know that. Second, I have read a lot of novels over the years. I most recently read in January, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. It is a masterpiece, but it's in its own way, it's pretty raw and brutal. Third, I have published 10 novels and have 10 more planned, with at least 4 of those in some draft form. So I know a little bit about the subject, and I read a lot about fiction as well. And what I'm going to say is going to be out of kindness and my wisdom, but sometimes it's going to seem a little snarky, so please bear with me. I want to start with the question, why? Know your why. What is your why, as you often hear? If you're doing it for money, that's not a good reason. There are a lot of other things you can do to make more money than writing novels. If you're doing it for glory, for literary fame, for artistic recognition, well, okay, but that's not going to come for a long time. And you have to be very good, so that's not really a good reason. If you're doing it because you think it's something you can do easily, because you've read a lot of novels or you like to write, let me just say it's incredibly time-consuming and incredibly frustrating to write a novel. And it's not as easy as it might look. Sometimes people say, I could write a book about that. And I just smile and make podcasts like this. Also in the realm of the why is, do you read novels already? Do you read novels widely? Do you just read one type, like you have a particular popular author, David Baldacci, Colleen Hoover's big now, etc. And so you read all of theirs and you read it, in that particular genre, and that's all you read. Well, that's a problem. You need to read widely, and you need to understand the structure of a novel, not just the way the novel makes you feel. Also, you need to realize that novels are not movies. If you want to write a movie, study screenwriting, and they are totally different kinds of writing. I took a screenwriting course a few years ago and hit a blank wall because it was so different. It's all visual, minimal words, things like that. So don't get your genre confused. You also have to remember that you have to be able to sustain the story for 60 words plus. That's a lot of words. Now, E.M. Forster, the English novelist from over 100 years ago, said that 50,000 words would make a novel. Fine. It's still a lot of words. If you've ever done the NaNoWriMo situation, they want 50 words in a month, but that's just a month. And so the length is specific words is not the issue. It's just that it has to be a sustained long story. And sometimes we think we have enough information or material for that, and we just don't. And as I already mentioned, you have to know the genres, and you have to know them well. Do you know what makes something a romance novel versus literary fiction? And you may not want to write literary fiction because a lot of people say, well, nothing happens in literary fiction, which is not entirely true. But it seems to be more focused on the setting and the character than it is the actual things happening in a plot. Do you know the difference between a hard-boiled detective versus a cozy mystery? Do you know the different kinds of romance novels? There's many different levels. So you have to dig into what the kind of genre is so that you know what you're writing. So at this point, if you haven't changed your mind, if I haven't talked you out of it, which I probably haven't, maybe you should think about it some more before you dedicate yourself to the year-long or more process of writing a novel. And I would start by asking you, can you answer the question, what is a novel? Do you know? It's a long story. Okay. It's something written like so-and-so. It's like this book. It's something that would be for the New York Times bestseller list. Well, those are not really what they are. Those are characteristics or effects. And I went to the most reliable source in the world, of course, Wikipedia, simply because it's easier, although I did look at a few other things. And it says that a novel is a long fictional narrative. Well, that says a lie, as you would expect to find in Wikipedia. I will continue to quote from them, that source. Quote, the novel in the modern era, which the term modern era has a lot of differences for what people, but it means in the 20th century, usually makes use of a literary prose style. And of course, as you know, with Wikipedia, they have little links here for you to understand those terms. The development of the prose novel at this time was encouraged by innovations in printing and the introduction of cheap paper in the 14th century. Some characteristics are intimacy and literary prose. Okay, so let's unpack this definition. What is long? Well, we've already said at least 50, but today most publishers are going to want more than that. What I would suggest is shorter chapters, but not shorter books. Now, I think if you get past 100,000 words, that's okay for some genres and in some types of novels and not for others. But some stories go on for longer than 100,000. But there may be a lot of fluff in there too. What is prose? Would be the next question. It means it's not poetry. It's not verse. For hundreds of years, long works like romances were stories in verse. And they were quite long. Of course, the one we usually think of is things like the Canterbury Tales or the Iliad and the Odyssey, which they were in poetry of that time. We have, in the modern era, a totally different view of the length we are willing to put up with for poetry. Very few people write epic poetry that's super long now, and pages and pages. Most poems are short. Intimacy was mentioned, and in this context, it means it's a private experience of the reader rather than a public experience. Novels aren't performed in public. You sit in a chair and read them alone, unlike theater or the ancients listening to epics like Homer's Odyssey. I think another interesting point is, would novels exist without cheap paper and printing? No, they wouldn't. It's interesting that technology controls art. We don't like to think of it, but it does. Just look into the history of paint products. Tubes of paint in the 1800s revolutionized painting. Mainly, it took it outdoors. Prior to that, painters had to paint in studios and make their own paints and have them there and under control. Once they could take them in little tubes out, you have your Monet and your Van Gogh, et cetera, and they're out in the open. I remember at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam that you can look at one of his paintings of the beach that I cannot pronounce in Dutch, and it's a family joke. It looks like Cheveringen, but that's not how it's pronounced. And there's sand in it because he was outside and it's so windy that you can see the sand in the painting. But then we come to the main question here, which is, what is fictional? And again, I'm going to quote from good old Wikipedia as a starting point. Typically, the fictionality of a work is publicly expressed, so the audience expects the work to deviate to a greater or lesser degree from the real world, rather than presenting, for instance, only factually accurate portrayals or characters who are actual people. Because fiction is generally understood as not adhering to the real world, and I'm putting air quotes around that because I don't know what the real world is. People tell me I don't work in the real world, but I pay bills and get a paycheck and everything like that. So anyway, the themes and context of a work, such as if and how it relates to real world issues or events, are open to interpretation. Aside from real world connection, some fictional works may depict characters or events within their own context, entirely separate from the known physical universe. an independent fictional universe, the creative art of constructing such an imaginary world is known as world building. End quote. You might want to go back and play that one again. I find this definition, although wordy and roundabout, fascinating. Speculative fiction, which is one genre, very popular today, is not based on the real world, and it's like sci-fi or fantasy, but it still has to adhere to rules the writer creates. And the world that is built must hold together logically. So, even though it's imaginative, it has to exist within certain parameters people can understand. And usually for it to be successful, I think, people need to see humanity within the characters, not just some wholly different way of experiencing the world. The word I like to use is verisimilitude. Modern fiction, except for the speculative type, can't get too far beyond the world we live in. There is a genre called magical realism, which is fascinating and is often seen in Latin American literature, where there is a real world, but magical elements intervene, so to speak, but in a limited way for a reason. A character might have a power that people don't really have, and they can use it at times. But again, it still has to work within certain boundaries. So fantasy stories are going to have much more magical elements in them. So that's a little bit about the theory, and I'll stop there. And my point being really that if you want to write a novel, you can't just sit down and start writing one day. You can. In fact, I say you probably want to just do a dump draft, if you will, to get it all on paper. But at some point, you're going to have to go back and start asking yourself questions like, what genre is this? What am I really trying to accomplish? Am I just trying to make a point, which will not work? Fiction is not designed to make a point. Fiction has themes. It explores the themes, but it doesn't come to a conclusion about the theme. It is one view of the theme, perhaps truth or relationships or love or forgiveness or whatever. It portrays people in those elements, but it doesn't give the final word on those elements, because in human experience, we don't get final words where we never have to struggle with something again until we've gone on to, in my worldview, to heaven, to be with Christ, but we have passed from this life. To be honest, I think many people really want to write their own stories, but at the same time, they realize that writing their own story is not going to be healthy or productive or safe for their own world. They might want to write about an abusive relative, but that relative is still alive, or something they've gone through, but people were affected by it and they don't want to hurt other people or get in trouble with other people, or even reveal certain things about themselves that would cause others to judge them. And therefore, they figure they'll write up a fictional depiction of it, and that will be safe. Maybe. In those cases, I have a few suggestions. Fiction may be the way to go, but just realize you still have to know what you're doing. And even if you write something where you try to closet your characters or yourself or some of your background, people are still going to read a first novel or a 10th novel and think that it's you. It's parts of your life, even if it's not. Even if you're using other people and not yourself, you are in there, first of all, and it's going to be assumed that certain things have happened to you or are part of your life. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. Secondly, what you might really want to write is creative nonfiction, and that is telling your story with literary techniques such as dialogue, plot, well-drawn characters, but telling your truth, telling your story. I would recommend a source. There are lots of books about this. www. Well, this is creativenonfiction.org. Okay. It actually doesn't have a www in it. It's just the HTTPS that people don't even know what that means anymore. Okay. So the most common creative nonfiction, although there are different types, is memoir. A memoir is about the author, not other people. So you have to choose how much of those other people you include. There are ways to get around it. You can write about one family member as a villain, but what about the rest of your family? You have to still tread carefully. No one wants to read about a total victim anyway. We want to read about someone overcoming problems. At this point, I would say you can write this for your own healing as a work in progress. And many people do that. It is a form of therapy and spiritual healing and growth. And then perhaps at another point, publish it when it won't hurt people. This then becomes a matter of motive. Do you want to write it to help other people or to pay somebody back for what they did to you, to draw attention to yourself, or what? What reason do you have for writing this story? Which I would say is true of any fiction. What reason do you have for writing this? There's also this situation where people want to write about their families because there's some interesting characters and situations. I think this is good. A lot of us have very colorful people in our backgrounds, in our genetic pool. And I would say fictionalize it because there still has to be a long narrative arc. You might have fun stories of your great-grandpa who did this and immigrated or was a bootlegger or whatever, but that doesn't hang together unless there is a long narrative arc. That means that the character starts one way, goes through circumstances where they have to make choices, and those two things of their choices and the circumstances come together to change them. They grow. They aren't the same person in the beginning that they are at the end. They are not just a piece of floss that gets tossed around on the waters of life. They are a person who makes decisions within their context. So that's the problem with writing about your family. You do have to have a bigger picture. Also, it may be that what you really want to write is short fiction, stories of 1,000 or 2,000, maybe up to 10,000, although that's stretching it a bit. Your story is about an incident, a moment. You can play with that. Short fiction is famously something that can be read in one sitting, and people can go through it and get to the end. This happened to me last week. I was introduced to a new writer, and I read his story and was annoyed by it. But when I got to the end, I was very satisfied and moved by it. So you can take a family story and write it in a controlled fictional way without having to plan a 70 or 80,000 word opus. Another value of writing short fiction is that you can get it published and then later use it for a longer work when you're ready to tackle that longer work, when you have a longer narrative to sort of clothespin that story into or base the rest of the story on. I have been writing short stories about my husband's family for years because they're an interesting group. And eventually it will make it into a full novel. I think I'm safe right now to do that. An example I will give is a story I recently sent to a literary magazine. Hopefully they'll like it. Maybe they won't. And I had earlier workshopped it with my writers group in Fort Oglethorpe. My husband tells a story of his grandfather shooting a stray dog who wandered onto the property. His grandfather raised fighting cocks, and he didn't want the dog near them. I took that story, and I should say that my husband was sort of scarred by it, I think, because he must have seen the dog getting shot. I took that story, put it in the same town where my husband spent some of his childhood, changed names across the board, readjusted the family structure, and turned that into the same basic idea of kids bringing a stray onto their grandfather's property, and the narrator, the oldest child, hearing a gunshot and concluding for years that his grandfather had killed the dog. This bothers him for many years, and he holds it against his grandfather. But, well, you'd have to read it and the rest of it. Honestly, when I wrote it, the first draft, I had 3 endings to the story. My writers group was so upset about the possibility of the dog being shot that I had to take that into account. The story is not about animal welfare, of course. It is really about conclusions we draw and how they control us. I often say my life is boring, but it's not. None of our lives are boring. If we have a fictional storytelling lens, there are many stories we can tell. So tell them, put them in writing, keep them to yourself or share them. After you've done the work, you can publish them. There are many literary magazines out there, and self-publishing is always an option. I would really, really warn you about signing any contracts. You can self-publish through Amazon or some other methods without putting out a lot of money. There are a lot of people out there who want to scam you, so be very careful. A friend gave me a mug that says, and this is a quote from Karen Kingsbury, "Your story is too beautiful not to tell." I have a lot of coffee mugs, but that one is just about my favorite. So tell your stories. Tell them joyfully and widely. There are lots of ways to tell them. You don't have to lock yourself into a novel. Thanks for listening. My next podcast, I hope, will be a group one to make up for this solo one, where I'm going to talk to the people in my writers group in Fort Oglethorpe about creativity in groups and supporting each other. I hope you'll be able to listen to that. And I hope that you'll go back and listen to past episodes and hear my fascinating discussions with all these other folks. Bye-bye.